They sent a woman to solve a problem of physics, and the men who worshipped force laughed. They saw a quiet analyst, a ghost in the machine, and dismissed her. Then the mountain turned against them. The wind became a weapon in the enemy's hands, and their brute force failed. In the end, when protocols were shattered and rank was meaningless, they turned to the ghost they had scorned. She answered not with words, but with a single, impossible shot that bent the laws of nature to her will. And when the legendary SEAL commander arrived, he walked past the captain, past the officers, and offered his salute not to the man in charge, but to the woman who had become the silent, undisputed master of the battlefield. The silence in forward operating base Nightingale was a physical thing. It was not the absence of noise, but a presence composed of it. The low, asthmatic hum of the diesel generators, the incessant whisper of wind scouring dust against canvas walls, and the distant, almost subliminal thrum of the earth itself. The base was a raw nerve ending, a temporary scar gouged into the ochre skin of the Hindu Kush, surrounded by mountains that were knives against a cobalt sky. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, a cramped tent filled with the sterile blue light of monitors and the smell of ozone and stale coffee, that silence was coiled, waiting. It lived in the spaces between radio clicks, in the long pauses of men who had been staring at the same digital topography for too many hours. Every surface was coated in a fine talc-like powder that muted colors and got into every mechanism, human and electronic. She sat at a terminal in the far corner, away from the central command table where maps were spread like shed skin. Her name, according to the temporary manifest, was Ilara Vance, a civilian geophysicist attached to Task Force Orion. It was a designation that meant nothing and everything. She wore sterile tan fatigues with no rank, no flag, no name tape. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, devoid of makeup or expression, seemed like another piece of the landscape, carved by patience and observation. Her corner was an island of esoteric data. One screen showed a live feed of atmospheric pressure gradients, isobars dancing in hypnotic, slow-motion waves. Another displayed a complex seismic model of the surrounding peaks, a web of fault lines and stress tensors rendered in greens and reds. She was not looking at the enemy. She was looking at the world the enemy inhabited, studying the grammar of the mountain itself. Her fingers moved across the keyboard of her ruggedized laptop with a quiet economy, her gaze flicking between data sets, building a picture no one else in the tent was capable of seeing. She tracked the Venturi effect through canyons miles away, correlated infrasonic readings with thermal upwellings, and mapped the subtle tectonic tremors that were the mountain's resting heartbeat. To the soldiers who occasionally glanced her way, she was an oddity, another egghead sent from a world of air conditioning and theory to meddle in their world of rock and steel. They saw her stillness and mistook it for passivity. They saw her focus on the environment and mistook it for a distraction from the real war. She felt their perception of her as a kind of low-grade static, an ambient pressure she had long since learned to filter out. It was irrelevant. The data was not. The mountain did not care about rank or opinion. It obeyed laws, and those laws were what she was here to understand. She traced a line on her screen, a potential acoustic shadow created by a concave granite face 12 kilometers to the northeast. A place where sound would die, a perfect blind spot. The canvas flap of the TOC was thrown open with a violent rasp, and Captain Thorne entered. He did not walk into the tent. He occupied it, his presence a sudden spike in atmospheric pressure. He was a man built of broad strokes, a jaw that seemed too square, a voice that was a blunt instrument, and a belief in his own authority that was as solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. He brought the heat and grit of the exterior with him, his uniform already dark with sweat despite the early hour. He was followed by his executive officer, a lieutenant who seemed to exist purely as Thorne's shadow. "Status," Thorne boomed, the word of physical impact in the quiet tent. He slapped a pair of leather gloves against the central map table, scattering a fine cloud of dust. A communications specialist, a young sergeant named Reyes, looked up from his console. His movements were precise, economical, in stark contrast to his commanders. "No change, sir. Overwatch has eyes on the eastern ridge, but the target's nest is still masked by the terrain. Thermal is useless. The rock face is holding too much solar heat. We lost contact with the ground team, call sign Pathfinder, 17 minutes ago. Last transmission indicated they were pinned down in the Almont Canyon." Thorne's jaw tightened. Almont Canyon, the Canyon of Death. The locals had named it well. It was a geological nightmare, a slot canyon whose walls were so sheer and contorted they defeated satellite imagery and scrambled radio waves. Sending men in there had been his decision, a direct application of force against a problem he refused to see as anything other than a nail waiting for his hammer. "Did they confirm the shooter's position?" he demanded. "Negative, sir," Reyes said, his voice flat, professional. "The shots are coming from everywhere and nowhere. The echoes in that canyon, it's a hall of mirrors for sound. Pathfinder said one shot sounded like it came from below them. Impossible, but that's what they reported." Thorne grunted, a sound of pure frustration. He paced the small space, his boots grinding on the dusty floor. His gaze swept the tent, assessing his tools, his assets. It was then that his eyes landed on Alara. He stopped, his head tilted in a gesture of dismissive curiosity. The silence in the tent shifted, becoming heavier, more focused. Every man in the room felt the sudden, uncomfortable spotlight. He strode over to her corner, his shadow falling over her screens. She did not look up, her focus remaining on the cascade of data. He was a large, loud object that had entered her peripheral vision, but her brain, trained for signal over noise, categorized him as the latter. "And what is this?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not address her directly, but spoke to the tent at large, as if she were a piece of equipment someone had left running. Reyes, sensing the impending friction, spoke up before she could. "That's Ms. Vance, sir, the geophysicist from command. She's analyzing environmental factors." "Environmental factors," Thorne repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were poison. He leaned closer, peering at her screen. He saw not a tactical map, but a swirling vortex of wind patterns and seismic lines. It was meaningless to him, an academic indulgence in the face of a firefight. "While my men are taking fire in a canyon, she's watching the weather." He tapped a thick finger on her monitor, a gesture of profound disrespect in her world. "Tell me, Ms. Vance, is it going to rain? Should my men have packed an umbrella?" The question hung in the air, thick with ridicule. The other soldiers in the tent shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes fixed on their consoles. This was a dominance display, a public dressing down designed to reinforce Thorne's authority and belittle anything outside his narrow tactical worldview. Alara finally lifted her head. Her eyes, a pale, clear gray, met his. They were calm, analytical, and utterly devoid of the fear or deference he expected. She took a moment, not for a dramatic effect, but to formulate the most precise and efficient answer possible. She saw his flushed face, the slight tremor of anger in his clenched jaw, the way he stood with his weight on the balls of his feet like a boxer. He was a system under pressure, predictable and dangerously unstable. "No, Captain," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange resonance in the tense air. It was a voice that seemed stripped of all inflection, a pure carrier of information. "It will not rain. However, the katabatic wind shear in Almont Canyon will increase by 15 knots in the next 20 minutes as the sun leaves the western face. The resulting thermal inversion will create a superior mirage, making any optical targeting from your current position impossible. The shots your men are hearing from below them are not an illusion. They are a primary echo reflecting off a concave facet of biotite granite with a high resonance frequency. The actual shooter is 1.9 kilometers upslope, nested in a limestone karst formation that masks his thermal and acoustic signature." She turned back to her screen, her statement delivered. It was not an opinion. It was a weather report, a geological survey, and a ballistic analysis rolled into one, presented with the flat certainty of a mathematical proof. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer coiled. It was fractured. Thorne stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a flustered apology or a nervous explanation. He had received a data dump that not only contradicted his entire understanding of the situation, but did so in a language he barely understood. He felt the eyes of his men on him, felt their respect for him waver for a fraction of a second. It was intolerable. "You have a sniper's hideout pinpointed from a weather chart," he scoffed, recovering his bluster. "That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. Reyes, get me air support on the line. I want a drone with kinetic strike capability over that canyon now. We'll flatten the whole damn ridge if we have to." "Sir, the canyon walls are too steep," Reyes interjected carefully. "The drone won't get a clear line of sight, and we still don't have a positive ID on the target's location. Firing blind could—" "Are you questioning my order, Sergeant?" Thorne snarled, turning his anger on the easier target. "No, sir," Reyes said, his face becoming a mask. He turned to his console and began relaying the command, though his movements were stiff with disagreement. Ilara watched the exchange without expression. She had provided the data. The interpretation and subsequent action were his responsibility. Her job was to understand the system, not the men who broke themselves against it. She saw the order for the drone strike for what it was: an act of ego, a desperate attempt to impose will upon a situation that required intellect. Brute force against a problem of geometry. The mountain would not yield. She turned her attention back to her screen, isolating the limestone formation she had identified. She ran a simulation, calculating the minute gravitational distortions, the density of the rock, the way it would absorb and radiate heat. She was building a firing solution for a problem no one else had yet acknowledged existed. The drone, a Predator, arrived on station 28 minutes later. Its camera feed appeared on the main screen in the TOC, a grainy top-down view of the jagged scar of Almont Canyon. The sun had indeed shifted, plunging one side of the chasm into deep, impenetrable shadow, while the other baked in the harsh afternoon light. As Ilara had predicted, thermal imaging was a blurry mess of hot and cold pockets, a Jackson Pollock painting of useless data. "Target area is the northern ridge," Thorne commanded, pointing a meaty finger at the screen. Reyes, talk the pilot onto it. I want him to walk ordnance from east to west. Saturation strike. Sir, Pathfinder team is still in the canyon, Reyes reminded him, his voice tight. The danger close radius on those munitions is… I am aware of the risks, Sergeant, Thorne cut him off. This is about acceptable losses. We take out that sniper, or we lose the whole team. Make the call. Reyes's hands hesitated over the controls. It was a bad order, a butcher's order, born of frustration. On the screen, the drone banked, its targeting reticle sweeping across the sun-blasted rock. From his small corner, Thorne watched with a grim satisfaction, a man convinced that overwhelming firepower was a substitute for thought. Alara continued her own work, her focus absolute. She isolated the precise coordinates of the karst formation. 34 degrees, 44 minutes, 15 seconds north. 69 degrees, 58 minutes, 23 seconds east. Elevation, 3,412 meters. She cross-referenced it with a declassified geological survey from the 1970s, noting the presence of a solutional cave system within the limestone. A natural fortress, perfect for a sniper's hide. The enemy shooter was not just a good marksman. He understood the terrain intimately. He was using the mountain as a shield, a megaphone, and a mirror. He was fighting a battle of physics, and Thorne had brought a club to a calculus competition. Suddenly, a new voice crackled over the command channel, ragged and desperate. It was the Pathfinder team leader. Nightingale, this is Pathfinder 1. We are taking fire. Direct fire. He's above us. I repeat, he is above us. A thin red line stitched across the drone's camera feed, followed by a puff of smoke and a shower of static. We've lost the feed, a tech shouted. The drone is hit. It's going down. Thorne stared at the screen, which now showed only a blizzard of white noise. The drone, his symbol of overwhelming power, had been swatted from the sky. The enemy sniper had not only evaded it, but had engaged and destroyed it. A sniper shooting down a drone from nearly 2 kilometers away from a concealed position in swirling winds. It was not just improbable, it was a declaration. This was not some local insurgent with a lucky shot. This was a professional of the highest caliber. The atmosphere in the TOC curdled from tense to critical. The air became thick with the metallic taste of fear. Thorne's face, which had been flushed with anger, was now pale with the shock of complete failure. His plan had not just failed, it had backfired catastrophically. He had lost a multi-million-dollar asset and revealed his own tactical impotence. The radio crackled again, the voice from Pathfinder 1 weak and strained. Nightingale, we have multiple KIA. We can't move. He's got us pinned, requesting immediate. The transmission ended in a burst of static. Thorne was frozen. The textbook had no page for this. The protocols, the standard operating procedures he clung to like a holy text, were useless. His entire operational philosophy, apply pressure, escalate force, break the target, had shattered against the granite walls of the canyon. He stood staring at the static-filled screen, a man whose authority had evaporated in a puff of smoke and shredded electronics. The men in the tent looked at him, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning contempt. They were looking for a leader, and they saw only a vacuum. Into that vacuum, a single quiet voice spoke. The shot is possible. Every head in the tent swiveled towards the corner. Alara had stood up. She held her ruggedized tablet in one hand. On its screen was a complex diagram of the canyon, overlaid with vectors, parabolas, and environmental data. She was not looking at Thorn. She was addressing the room, addressing the problem itself. "The target is located in the karst formation I identified," she stated, her voice the calm center of the storm. "He is shielded from direct line of sight by a granite overhang. Standard ballistics cannot reach him. Air support cannot reach him, but the wind you are fighting can be used." Thorn finally broke from his stupor, his face contorting with a fresh wave of indignant fury. The civilian analyst was lecturing him? Now? "Used how?" he spat, the words laced with disbelief. "Are you suggesting we can blow him off the mountain?" "No," Alara replied, her gaze unwavering. "I am suggesting a calculated indirect fire solution, a single shot. The bullet will not fly directly to the target. It must be fired at a 3.2-degree offset to the north into the main wind channel. The katabatic flow will act as a transport mechanism, carrying the projectile on a parabolic curve around the primary obstruction. At the apex of its trajectory, it will enter a shear layer, where a thermal updraft from the sun-heated rock face will provide a 6-meter lift, correcting its altitude. It will then pass through the acoustic shadow, where its sonic crack will be muffled before striking the limestone facet at a 77-degree angle. The limestone is weathered. A .338 Lapua Magnum armor, piercing round will not ricochet. It will penetrate, spall on the interior of the cave, and neutralize the target. She paused, letting the information settle. She had just described a shot that sounded like something from a science fiction novel. A bullet that rode the wind, climbed on a heat wave, and performed a bank shot off a mountain. It was an elegant, insane, and utterly impossible solution. Thorn let out a short, barking laugh, a sound devoid of any humor. "That's a fantasy. You're insane. You're talking about threading a needle from 2 kilometers away in a hurricane using a bullet that has a mind of its own. It's not possible." "It is not a fantasy," Alara said, her tone unchanged. "It is a problem of multivariable calculus and fluid dynamics. It is difficult. It is not impossible. The probability of success with the correct weapon system and a cold-bore shot is 89%. She looked past Thorn, her eyes finding Sergeant Reyes. He had been listening intently, his face a mask of concentration. Unlike Thorn, he was not hearing fantasy. He was hearing the language of systems, of variables, of a logic so advanced it bordered on arcane. He saw the cold confidence in her eyes, the absolute certainty that came not from ego, but from calculation. He thought of his men, bleeding out in that canyon, and he looked at his captain, who offered nothing but bluster and failed ideas. The hierarchy of rank was dissolving, being replaced by a hierarchy of competence. "We don't have a sniper on this base who can even comprehend that shot, let alone make it," Thorn declared, trying to reassert his authority by stating a simple fact. "You do," Alara said simply. A heavy silence descended once more. Thorn stared at her, the implication of her words slowly dawning on him. He looked at her small frame, her analyst's hands, her unassuming presence. The idea was so ludicrous, so far outside the rigid tramlines of his military mind, that he could only sputter. You're a scientist, a weather girl." Before Alara could respond, Reyes spoke, his voice firm and clear, cutting through his captain's derision. "Sir, what other option do we have? Pathfinder team has minutes, maybe less. We can either try her solution, or we can sit here and listen to them die." It was a direct challenge, not to Thorn's rank, but to his conscience. The other men in the tent turned to Reyes, a silent wave of support passing between them. They had seen their captain's failure. They were now willing to gamble on the quiet woman's impossible promise. Authority in that moment flowed away from the man with the eagles on his collar and coalesced around the woman with the tablet. Thorn looked around the room, seeing the shift in his men's eyes. He saw their faith in him was gone, replaced by a desperate hope in her. He was trapped. To refuse was to condemn his men and cement his own incompetence. To agree was to cede command to a civilian analyst in everything but name. His face was a thundercloud of rage and humiliation. "Fine," he ground out, the word tasting like ash. "This is on your head, all of it." He gestured to the base armory. "Get her whatever she needs." He had tried to make it a threat. Instead, it was an abdication. Alara simply nodded, her expression giving no hint of triumph or emotion. She turned to Reyes. "I need the M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, the one with the Schmidt and Bender 5-25 x 56 PM2 scope. And I need your team's best spotter. I need real-time wind readings from 3 separate points along the canyon's edge." "You've got it," Reyes said without hesitation. He was already moving, relaying orders into his headset, his voice crisp and efficient. The entire operational tempo of the TOC had changed, reorienting around her. She was the new center of gravity. She walked out of the tent, leaving Thorn stewing in his own impotent fury. The harsh sunlight hit her, and the wind, the same wind she had been studying on a screen, whipped strands of hair across her face. It was no longer an abstract data point. It was a tangible force, a river of air she was about to navigate. She did not see it as an obstacle. She saw it as an ally. The mountain had presented a problem, and now she was going to provide the answer. The firing position was on the roof of the TOC, a makeshift platform of sandbags and steel plates that offered the clearest available line of sight toward the Almont Canyon. The air up there was thin and sharp, tasting of dust and altitude. The wind was a constant physical pressure, a sculptor's hand shaping the silence. Sergeant Reyes was already there, a high-powered spotting scope mounted on a heavy tripod, its lens pointed toward the distant, hazy ridge. 2 other soldiers manned small, portable weather stations, their anemometers spinning furiously. They called out readings into their headsets, their voices tight with a nervous energy that was part fear, part awe. Alara moved with a fluid, practiced grace that seemed utterly at odds with her previous stillness. She laid out a canvas mat, placing the M2010 rifle onto it with the reverence of a surgeon laying out their instruments. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, a fusion of steel and polymer and glass, but to her, it was merely a tool, a device for applying a precise amount of force at a specific point in space-time. She attached the suppressor, not for stealth, but to minimize muzzle blast and the resulting dust signature. She checked the seating of the scope, the torque on the mounting rings, the cold, smooth action of the bolt. Her movements were economical, stripped of any wasted motion. They were the actions of someone for whom the weapon was an extension of their own senses. Reyes watched her, his professional eye missing nothing. He had seen hundreds of snipers in his career, from cocky young marksmen to seasoned veterans. He had never seen anyone move like this. There was no bravado, no ritual. It was a pure, clinical interaction with the machine. She was not preparing to take a life. She was preparing to solve an equation. She settled behind the rifle, her body molding to the stock and the ground until she seemed to become part of the platform. She peered through the scope, the world dissolving into a magnified, cross-hatched circle. The distant ridge swam into focus, a brutal landscape of fractured rock and heat shimmer. To the naked eye, it was a uniform wall of stone. Through the lens, she could see the subtle striations, the darker patches of lichen, the almost imperceptible fissure that marked the entrance to the karst cave. It was exactly where her data had said it would be. There was no visible sign of the enemy sniper. There wouldn't be. "Wind readings," she said, her voice a low murmur, muffled by the stock pressed against her cheek. "Station 1, holding at 22 knots, gusting to 28. From 330, a soldier called out. Station 2, variable. 18 knots from 315, another reported. "Reyes, what do you see at the target area?" Alara asked. Her breathing had already slowed, her heart rate dropping to a steady, metronomic beat. Reyes squinted into his own scope. "Heavy mirage. The heat coming off that rock face is like a waterfall. I can't get a clear reading. It's a mess." "That's the thermal updraft," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's on schedule." She began making minute adjustments to the scope's elevation and windage knobs. The clicks were tiny, precise sounds against the roar of the wind. She was not just accounting for the wind they could measure. She was accounting for the wind she had modeled, the unseen currents and eddies that flowed through the canyon like water. She was factoring in the Coriolis effect, the subtle spin of the earth that would pull the bullet sideways over its long flight. She was calculating spin drift, the gyroscopic precession of the projectile, ye hell. She was building a three-dimensional tapestry of forces in her mind, a world of invisible architecture through which the bullet would have to pass. She slid a single cartridge from the box, a .338 Lapua Magnum, 300 grain. The brass was cool and heavy in her hand. She chambered the round with a smooth, decisive motion, the click of the bolt locking into place seeming to silence the world around her. Now there was only the rifle, the wind, and the problem. "Confirm target coordinates," she said, her voice calm. "Coordinates confirmed," Reyes responded, his own voice tight. "But Alara, I don't have a visual. We're firing blind." "You are," she corrected him gently. "I am not." She closed her eyes for a moment. She was not praying. She was visualizing. She saw the bullet leaving the muzzle, a tiny speck of copper and lead. She saw it caught by the wind, a leaf in a storm, but a leaf with a purpose. She saw it curve around the granite wall, a graceful, impossible arc. She saw it climb on the thermal wave, lifted as if by an unseen hand. She saw it slip through the acoustic dead zone, a silent ghost. And she saw it strike the weathered limestone, not with a clang of ricochet, but with a dull, percussive thud of penetration. She saw the spalling inside the cave, a shotgun blast of rock and metal in a confined space. She opened her eyes. Her world had narrowed to the reticle of the scope, a black cross suspended over a shimmering, indistinct patch of rock nearly 2 kilometers away. Her finger rested on the trigger. She was no longer breathing. She had entered the still point, the infinitesimal pause between heartbeats where the world held its breath with her. The wind howled. The data flowed through her. The calculation was complete. Now. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a solid, controlled punch. The sound was a deep, throaty cough, swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the suppressor. A small cloud of dust kicked up from the roof, and the smell of burnt cordite cut through the air. The tiny projectile was gone, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, on its journey into the invisible architecture of the air. For 5 long seconds, there was nothing. The bullet was in flight, a traveler on its impossible journey. 5 seconds that stretched into an eternity. Reyes held his breath, his eye glued to his spotting scope, searching for any sign, any puff of dust, any glint of impact. The soldiers with the anemometers had fallen silent. Even Thorne, who had emerged from the TOC to watch the spectacle he was certain would fail, stood rigid, his face a mask of disbelief. Then Reyes spoke, his voice cracking with astonishment. "Impact! I have dust! On the limestone facet, high and to the right of the overhang, a direct hit on the coordinates." Still, there was silence. A puff of dust was not confirmation. The enemy sniper could be unharmed, merely startled. The radio, which had been quiet for agonizing minutes, remained so. The tension on the rooftop became unbearable, a physical weight pressing down on them all. And then, a new voice, faint but clear, from the radio. It was Pathfinder 1. Nightingale, do you copy? The firing has stopped. Repeat, the firing has stopped. We're clear." There was a pause, filled with the sound of ragged breathing. "We don't know what happened. There was a noise from up on the ridge, like a rock slide inside the cave. And then, nothing. The pressure is gone. He's gone." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief went through the talk and across the rooftop. It was a sound of disbelief, of a miracle witnessed. Men looked at each other, then at the small, quiet woman who was now calmly ejecting the spent shell casing. The small brass cylinder tinkled as it hit the steel plate. The only sound in a world suddenly struck dumb with awe. She had done it. The impossible shot. The fantasy. She had bent the wind and the light and the very rock of the mountain to her will. She had reached through 2 kilometers of hostile air and erased a threat that had defeated drones and men and tactics. She had solved the equation. Alara pushed herself up from the mat, her movements just as deliberate as before. She showed no elation, no relief, no sign of triumph. The problem was solved. She was already moving on. She began to clean the rifle, her focus already shifted to the maintenance of her tool. Thorne stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Everything he knew about warfare, about ballistics, about the limits of the possible, had been incinerated in the last 5 seconds. He looked at Alara, at this unassuming woman who had just performed an act of tactical wizardry that would be told in whispers for years. He saw not a scientist, but a weapon, a force of nature far beyond his comprehension. His authority was not just broken, it was irrelevant. Just then, the high-priority communications channel chirped to life in the TOC, the unique tone signaling a flag officer. Reyes, still reeling, scrambled down the ladder to answer it. A moment later, his head reappeared. "Captain Thorne," he called out, his voice filled with a new, strange formality. "It's Commander Valerius, from SEAL Team 3. Pathfinder is his unit. He's inbound on a Black Hawk. ETA is 10 minutes. Thorne's blood ran cold. Commander Valerius was a living legend in the special operations community, a man whose reputation was forged in the deadliest conflicts of the last 2 decades. He was not a man who tolerated incompetence, and Thorne had just lost a drone and nearly lost an entire team under his command, a team that belonged to Valerius. The reckoning was coming. The Black Hawk arrived not in 10 minutes, but in 7. It did not circle or wait for clearance. It descended upon FOB Nightingale like a bird of prey, its rotor wash kicking up a blinding storm of dust and sand. It settled onto the landing pad with a controlled violence that was a statement in itself. The side door slid open, and 3 men disembarked. They moved with the coiled, predatory grace of apex predators, their gear worn like a second skin. The man in the lead was tall and lean, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. His eyes, even from 50 yards away, seemed to miss nothing. This was Commander Valerius. Captain Thorne, having hastily tried to compose himself, marched out to meet him, his executive officer trailing a step behind. He put on his best command face, a mask of control and authority he no longer felt. This was the moment to control the narrative, to frame the near disaster as a hard-won victory under his leadership. "Commander Valerius, welcome to Nightingale," Thorne began, extending a hand. "Captain Thorne, we had a bit of a situation here, but I'm pleased to report it is now under control. Your men are safe." Valerius did not slow his stride. He did not look at Thorne's extended hand. He walked past the captain as if he were a piece of furniture, his gaze sweeping the base, taking in the sandbagged rooftop, the tension in the air, the cluster of soldiers who were now gathered, watching. His eyes landed on the TOC, and he strode towards it. Thorne, his hand still hanging foolishly in the air, felt a hot flush of shame and anger. He turned and hurried after the SEAL commander, his own authority completely negated on his own base. "Commander, my analyst provided some key environmental data that—" he started, trying to salvage some shred of credit. Valerius entered the TOC. He took in the scene at a glance, the static-filled main screen, the men standing by their consoles, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. And in the corner, Ilara, who had finished cleaning the rifle and was now disassembling it for transport, her movements precise and unhurried. The commander stopped. His 2 SEALs flanked the entrance, silent sentinels. The air in the tent became thick, heavy with unspoken protocol and the crushing weight of Valerius's presence. He looked at the tactical displays, at the coordinates Ilara had marked, at the flight path of the failed drone. He saw the entire story of the last hour laid out in data. He understood. Then he turned and walked directly toward Ilara. She looked up from her work as he approached. Her gray eyes met his. There was a flicker of recognition, a silent communication that passed between them, a shared understanding forged in places and situations Thorne could not even imagine. Commander Valerius, a man who commanded the most elite warriors on the planet, a man before whom generals tread carefully, came to a halt 2 feet in front of the quiet civilian analyst. He drew himself up to his full height. He raised his right hand, crisp and sharp, to the brim of his cap. He executed a perfect, formal salute. "Spectre," he said, his voice a low, respectful gravel. "It's good to see you operational. We owe you one. My boys are alive because of you." The name hung in the air. Spectre. It meant nothing to Thorne, but to Reyes and a few of the more experienced comms techs, a rumor, a ghost story told in hushed tones, suddenly coalesced into a stunning reality. Spectre was not a person, it was a program. A single mythical operator attached to the Joint Special Operations Command. A specialist they called when a mission was deemed impossible. A hyper-lethal ghost who didn't exist on any official roster. A master of ballistics and environmental science whose legend was built on shots that defied the laws of physics. They had not been hosting a geophysicist. They had been hosting a legend. Ilara simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "They were good men, Commander. They deserved a better plan." The statement was flat, factual, yet it landed in the silent tent with the force of a hammer blow, a final devastating indictment of Thorne's command. Valerius dropped his salute. He turned his head slowly, his cold, assessing gaze finally falling upon Captain Thorne, who stood by the map table, his face the color of wet cement. "Captain," Valerius said, his voice losing all its warmth, becoming a shard of ice. "You ordered a kinetic strike on a position with an unconfirmed target, while my men were within the blast radius. You sacrificed a Tier 1 asset because you were too arrogant to listen to the expert your superiors sent you. You prioritized your ego over the lives of the men you are sworn to protect. You are relieved of command, effective immediately. Pack your things. A transport will be here at 600 to fly you back to Bagram, where you will face a board of inquiry." Each word was a nail hammered into the coffin of Thorne's career. He opened his mouth to protest, to argue, but the look in Valerius's eyes slammed it shut. There was no appeal. There was no debate. There was only the cold, hard fact of his failure and its consequences. He deflated, the bluster and arrogance draining out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out man in a uniform that suddenly seemed too big for him. A new order had been established. It was not an order of rank or regulation, but one of pure, undeniable competence. The hierarchy had been violently realigned with reality. The atmosphere on Fob Nightingale transformed overnight. The oppressive tension was replaced by a quiet, focused energy. The soldiers moved with a renewed purpose, their conversations hushed, their glances toward the talk filled with a kind of mythic reverence. The story of the shot spread through the base like wildfire, each telling adding another layer of impossible detail. They no longer saw a strange civilian. They saw the architect of a miracle. They called her Spectre. Ilara, for her part, seemed oblivious to the change. She returned to her corner, to her screens of data, her focus just as absolute as it had been before. She showed no pleasure in Thorne's downfall, no pride in her newfound status. The outcome had been the logical result of the variables at play. Ego was a variable. Incompetence was a variable. She had simply factored them into her solution. Her victory was not emotional, it was mathematical. Late that evening, as she was running a post-action analysis of the atmospheric conditions that had made the shot possible, Sergeant Reyes approached her corner. He did not come with praise or congratulations. He held out a battered metal thermos. "Coffee," he said simply. "Figured you could use it." She looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. She saw in his face not adoration, but a deep professional respect. It was a currency she valued far more than rank or commendation. She accepted the thermos with a nod. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. He hesitated for a moment, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the spent shell casing had hit the roof. "The shot," he began, his voice low. "The spalling effect you predicted, how did you know the limestone would be weathered enough? From 2 kilometers away, through a scope. How could you possibly know the rock's tensile strength?" She took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, black, and bitter. Perfect. "I saw a lichen," she replied. "Xanthoria elegans. It grows at a predictable rate, approximately 0.5 millimeters per year, but only on calcareous rock that has a pH above 6.0. The size and spread of the colony I observed indicated the rock face had been exposed to erosive elements for at least 80 years. That level of weathering guarantees a low tensile strength, making it susceptible to fragmentation from a hypervelocity impact." Reyes stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the layers of knowledge required to make such a deduction. Geology, biology, ballistics, meteorology. She saw the world not as a collection of objects, but as a single, interconnected system. She had not just seen a rock, she had read its history in a patch of orange fungus and used that knowledge to save his men. It was the truest form of mastery he had ever witnessed. He just nodded slowly, a profound understanding dawning in his eyes. "Thank you," he said again, but this time it meant something more. He turned and walked away, leaving her to her work. It was the quiet acknowledgement, the passing of a torch from a good soldier to a true master. Her purpose here was fulfilled. The external threat was neutralized, the internal incompetence excised. The system was balanced once more. Before dawn, another black helicopter, as silent and unmarked as the first, descended through the cold mountain air. Alara packed her few belongings into a single bag, her rifle case and her laptop, the tools of her trade. She walked to the waiting aircraft, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the mountains. Commander Valerius was there to see her off. They exchanged no words, only a final, respectful nod. As she stepped into the helicopter, she was no longer Alara Vance, the geophysicist. She was Spectre, a ghost returning to the shadows, her passage marked only by the impossible story she left behind. The helicopter lifted off, its form dissolving into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a silence that was no longer tense or waiting, but clean and calm. She left as she arrived, an enigma. She was a weapon forged from intellect, a quiet professional in a world of noise and fury. She sought no recognition, no reward, only the clean, cold logic of a problem solved. The men of FOB Nightingale would never forget the lesson she taught them, that true authority is not worn on a collar or shouted in a command tent. It is demonstrated in the silent, flawless execution of the impossible. In the lonely high places of the world, where the laws of physics are the only laws that matter, competence is the only rank that has any meaning. She was a ghost, a whisper, a legend, a testament to the fact that the most powerful force on any battlefield is a single, focused mind that sees the world as it truly is.